Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And this week, we're talking about ways of giving back. We've talked about things like volunteering at your company. We've talked about giving. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future work. And I'm here with Teddy Schleifer, who is a journalist who I began to read when he was writing about what some of the very wealthiest, let's just call it what it is, people in the tech industry, is maybe you wrote about folks in other industries too, but I was mostly following what you were doing about tech, what they were doing to try to make the world better. And it's always interesting to me because some ways we can do the things that they do. We can give to some of the same organizations. Some ways we can't because, you know, they're billionaires, space aliens, literally in yesterday's case. And now Teddy's starting a new publication called Puck, which you can share about what you want to share about. And we'll link to his newsletter he's doing in the meanwhile. But today's question is, if I look at the examples of those very most, the wealthiest people and how they give, what could I learn about how to be more effective in trying to give to drive change? And thank you, Teddy.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, ultimately, I think charity is personal to some extent, right? It is. So who am I to say what rich people should do or not with their money?
By the way, this whole thing is called "This Is Not Advice," so we're not saying what anybody should do. We're just literally, I'm asking you for the reported observations on what.
Sure. So the reported observation is, I think often there is little to no reckoning with the fact that people screw up. And that's okay, right? I mean, obviously, people screw up all the time, but what often frustrates me as someone who covers this space is this fantasy land that I think lots of billionaire philanthropists invent that like everything's going great, and you know, serious journalistic scrutiny on kind of mega philanthropic bets is like a personal attack, right? That like if you're to say like Mark Zuckerberg's effort in Newark public schools in 2010 did not work, that is a journalistic fact that ultimately like we should be able to say out loud and not see it as some indictment of your personal character. So I think one of the takeaways that I've had from covering Silicon Valley wealth over the last few years is generally people are not willing to wrestle with that. That people screw up and there are mistakes that are made. So that's one thing I think. The second is oftentimes, and this is related, there's not really a culture of transparency when it comes to big philanthropy. One big trend over the last decade or so is lots of wealthy Silicon Valley titans setting up vehicles that are antithetical or allergic to transparency. And I don't think that's like a byproduct of necessarily of wanting to do something creative. Oftentimes the opacity is the point. So ultimately I am as a reporter pro transparency, but I also think it's often good for the donor as well to wrestle with screwing up and making it public when you screw up.
Well, I think that, so I think they're great. So many nuggets in there. And as you know, I'm on the board or the advisory board of Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and we do this gathering called First Principles to try to learn about how to be philanthropic, which we'll talk more about. But you and I can talk more about. But I think that, like, to me, the core of that insight is if you assume that the reason somebody gives is to drive change, well, then lots of assumptions can follow from that. Like, let's see if it actually had that result. What I've noticed about many people is that they're not honest with themselves about the reason why they're giving. Mm-hmm. Is being honest with yourself about it. It's like, okay, I'm doing this because it feels good for me. And if the reason you're doing it is because it feels good and not because you want a result, well, then transparency matters less, results matter less. I mean, just being really candid. I'm not saying that's a
sure.
I'm not saying that. I'm certainly not defending that. But I think it's the wrestling with I was trying to think, why don't people do that? And I think part of it is that it requires a little bit of wrestling with what your own motivation is. And it's okay. Like, I give to a lot of things because somebody asked me to.
Right.
And I value my relationship with that person. In fact, dirty secret, if anybody's watching, basically anybody who I trust who asks me to give to something, as long as I don't ethically object to the thing, like, I'll give something. I tend to give in multiples of 18 because of,
right. Your DMs are lighting up right now.
I know, but then there's a lot of $1.80 gifts because I do change where the decimal point goes by many orders of magnitude. And and the thing about transparency, which I so buy, and I've seen folks like Open Philanthropy going in the other direction, which I think has been really constructive, and we're big believers in it too, is a lot of that also feels to me, and this is something I hear from people in tech, we're like, hey, I'm starting to have money. I want to be able to give it away. What do I do? A lot of what they hear from professionals who tell them what to do is driven by tax. And a lot of the rationale
100%.
for the lack of transparency is because ultimately what many professional advisors do is not, hey, how can I have the most impact with your money? It's how can I save the most on taxes subject to trying to have an impact? And even simple things like, oh, I didn't realize if I put it in a tax-free vehicle, I can't give it to political candidates. It's stuff that people forehead slap about. So I think those are great comments, and I really appreciate that. And I'm also excited. Let me just ask you one last little parting thing, which is,
Sure.
Do you see ways in which the way that people who have resources, wealth, are giving is evolving recently, like in a productive way? I mean, the Mackenzie Scott, money raining on the sky from so many nonprofits. Maybe that's just one example, but are there trends? I don't know if that's a blip or a trend. Are there themes in how people's giving is changing?
I think there's a less of an emphasis on legacy building among
named buildings and stuff like that.
Sure, David Geffen-esque, people who donate stuff to, name something after themselves. But I mean, I think two things. A, you mentioned Mackenzie. Obviously, she has, in some ways, exposed a great lie of kind of the charitable industrial complex, which is that it is utterly impossible to give away money quickly enough. I do think that some of the hoopla around Mackenzie has gotten a little bit ahead of itself. Like I want to check back on like 3 or 4 years to see whether or not she's actually like solved the world's problems.
Can I just interrupt in a second before
Sure.
Your next point was, immigrant family, we express love through interruption, is I think that part of the hoopla was the charitable industrial complex to give, to want more of it. So create some hoopla because we want some more people doing that.
Yeah, for sure.
Beneficiaries,
As a reporter covering it, though, I'm saying like I do think that like I'm trying
to describe their motivation,
keep the excitement in check. Sure. I think she has shown in terms of trends that it is possible to do this at a faster speed. And as to your point about folks who get wealthy generally being driven by taxes, I think there's an inertia of being wealthy that makes you not necessarily want to spend the money, not because it's not a Scrooge McDuck thing where people are rich and want to, have billions of dollars in cash under their mattress. I think a lot of it is inertia. A lot of it is fear of screwing up. And, it's easier to delay the decision, right? Let's say you have an IPO and you have $1 billion in appreciated stock. You just stick it in a donor advised fund, you stick it in a foundation, you have a family member kind of tend to it every year or so. You just delay decision making.
Rob Reich pointed out, the Stanford professor with whom we collaborate closely on a bunch of things, including philanthropy learning, pointed out that Mackenzie Scott gave away all that money, and because of what happened to the price of Amazon stock, she now has more money than when she started.
Yeah.
And there's something around the psychology of wealth around this that I think is worth exploring. And the part that I just want to say, just to express sympathy for those who are criticized for giving, is I think there's a very natural human psychology, which is like, hey, I did all this stuff, I made all this money, whether I got lucky or I worked hard or whatever, I'm trying to do the right thing. Why are you giving me beef? That's the valid part. But also people give, for reasons that have nothing to do with trying to do the right thing.
And when I sympathize with that too. I do think it depends on the type of giving we're talking about. I mean, lots of charitable efforts affect public life.
And also, like, just because they don't like it doesn't mean it's not fair game. I mean, there's no rule. I mean, hey, I wish you didn't do that. It's like, well, okay, but
sure. And also, the definition of philanthropy is so broad. I mean, like, giving to the Heritage Foundation is philanthropy. Giving to lots of political efforts is like effectively philanthropy, and you get a tax break for it. So I often find myself praying for nuance in this debate, which I will never fight. I will never win.
Give me both. Some nuance.
But ultimately, I do think that I disagree with the idea that reporting on philanthropy seriously and reckoning with the wins and the losses and And that's an important topic of
Oh,
journalistic
of course. I mean,
scrutiny.
it is, the criticism
Yeah,
that is illegitimate is absurd to me. I think
yeah,
we
but I mean, I began this by saying that philanthropy is personal, and sometimes I find that lots of donors cling to that argument, which I think is true, as a shield against people like me, and like just because it's personal, and does not mean that it is off limits and
100%.
unrealistic.
And look,
So
I think that part of the reason why philanthropists have, I mean, Martin Luther King was, that I'm not going to try to remember his quote because I'll butcher it, but his sentiment that that part of the reason philanthropists have the wealth is because of social systems that we all co-created to begin with, and so if that wealth was not just created by that person but by the society, then the use of that wealth is something that the public has an interest in as well. So we're on the same page on that. I think the interesting thing to me is that in that fight about the legitimacy of the coverage, often what's lost is the thing that you started with here, which is, okay, but what should a person do? And what a person should do is reckon with the fact that there may be failures, embrace that. Rob Reich again says, this thing about it's not accountable money. Use that to do things that if you were accountable, nobody would let you do, and try to take some risks. I mean, philanthropy, I think at its best is the risk capital for society to try to make things better. And some of it then gets done by government. Anyway.
Yeah. So like, I mean, to the point about Zuckerberg and Newark, like it's a failure, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's like, a mistake, right?
Right.
And ultimately,
By the way, everybody in the startup industry knows from startup stuff is like, anyway, sorry, I interrupted you again.
No, but ultimately, I would love to see more philanthropists trying stuff. Like, I was often, I'm sometimes asked who I respect the most. And I bring up two people, neither of whom are old, but one is Dustin Moskovitz, who, has a net worth of over $20 billion and is in his 30s and is like, has a point of view and is trying stuff. Now, like, is
not just Dustin, Joe too. I mean, the other thing I'd just say about philanthropy, speaking of which, we have a comment from my wife in the comments here on Twitter, is one way in which it's personal is that it's a family affair. So it's not just
not just Dustin Carey. Yeah, but like, I guess I have a lot of respect for the fact that they are trying stuff, and if they, even if you disagree with effective altruism, which is sort of the prism through which they do their philanthropy, like they're in their 30s and doing stuff, which is not true of lots of 30s. And the other person is Patrick Collison, who is not doing a ton. His company's still private, but he is sort of a new guard of young politics adjacent.
And he's at a clear
philanthropist.
Science, among other areas.
He's a. I guess I respect folks who have a point of view, who make decisions rather than just delaying and
by the way, same thing for Jack,
figuring it out later,
putting money away, all that stuff. So here's to that. And I think in one way, the best of that is taking. I don't want to make it sound too parallel. Mike Bloomberg has this joke. He says, in business, it's dog eat dog, and in government, it's the other way around. And we could sort of say the same for maybe philanthropy and business, but there is a parallel in the sense that the same attitude toward acknowledgement, you need to try many experiments, have a conviction and a point of view, be resilient to failure, seems to apply to giving as well as it does to, the thing that you did to give you the capacity to give in the first place.
For sure.
All right. Well, that is not advice for today because neither of us is telling anybody what to do. And Teddy, thank you. I hope we can do this on other subjects, and I'm looking forward to Puck.
Thanks so much.